So this is the long-awaited mirrorless flagship from Canon. We finally are getting a look at the EOS R1. Canon have designed this as a 24 megapixel professional camera capable of shooting up to 40 frames per second, blackout free. The camera is also great for filmmakers as it's going to give you the ability to record up to 6K 60p raw video files. Is this camera worth the wait? Well, we're gonna talk about that in this video. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are gonna take a look at the new Canon R1. This has probably been the most anticipated flagship from any camera company that we have seen this far. Now, before we get going here, I do want to give you a little bit of context around what we're gonna be talking about in this video. So, Canon graciously invited me to come out to Phoenix, Arizona a few weeks ago to get a hands-on first look at the R1 as well as the R5 Mark II. I'm gonna do a separate video on the R5 Mark II because it's a different camera. Now, the way press trips typically work is a company will have a product that is ready to go. They invite people to come and get a hands-on look at it, and then you can prepare your video, write your article, whatever it is that you're doing, and there's an embargo date. This one is very different. Now, Canon just had the development announcement of this camera very recently. We're getting a very early first hands-on look with this. And so this camera is not slated to come out until way later this year. In fact, when I was there, I looked in the camera at the firmware version. I don't remember what it was exactly, but it was like 0.4. So this is a very early hands-on first look. This is not a review. I just want to go over what the camera will do and give you some thoughts on it. I think it's largely pretty exciting. So let's get going and have a look at the Canon R1. So there's been a lot of speculation about the R1 for a long time, and Canon are in a position where they're a little bit pressured with this camera because Sony and Nikon already have their flagships in place. And so there's been some talk about this. This is the first we're actually seeing of it. So the R1 is designed around a brand new backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor with high-speed readout. So we're dealing with a stacked configuration. This is what we've seen from Sony as well as Nikon. Now, what sets the R1 apart a little bit is we do have the DIGIC X processor from the EOS R3. However, we have an added-on accelerator, which is built into the camera, which enables captures of large volumes of data. It's going to instantly perform an analysis of the scene that you're photographing, and it gives you a ton of processing with way more advanced autofocus computations. The camera will deliver burst speeds up to 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter, completely blackout free. Now, the camera still has a mechanical shutter, which sets it apart. And the reason for this is because there are situations, especially at stadiums and sporting events, where you have these complicated LED screens and the frame rate is such that it will vary and it's hard to dial into the camera. So these are instances where Canon felt the mechanical shutter still was necessary. I actually like having a mechanical shutter for normal non-high speed use. Call me old school, I like the haptic feedback, but just know that it is there, and I think this was a wise decision on Canon's behalf. Of course, you can go over to the electronic shooter when you want that 40 frames per second. Now, the EOS R1 does feature a 24.2 megapixel sensor. However, you can do in-camera upscaling up to 45 megapixels. Now, this will be very useful for people who shoot sports or events or photojournalists who need a higher output file at some point. It is JPEG only, but that accelerator does enable us to do this in-camera. It works really well, and it looks pretty good. That accelerator will also enable neural network noise reduction. This is also in camera, and you can shoot up to ISO 102,300. Now, that is crazy high ISO, but I did do some testing with the noise reduction in camera. Looks pretty good. I don't want to give a final opinion at this point because this is early firmware, but the results that I had were very impressive. That accelerator also allows us to use some AI buzzwords as well. So we've got automatic exposure white balance using deep learning, 6,144 zone metering points, and we've got coordinated in-body and optical image stabilization. Canon are stating this will give you 8.5 stops at the center and 7.5 stops at the peripheral. Video specs on the EOS R1 are very impressive as well. The whole camera is built to the Cinema EOS standard. You can shoot up to 6K 60p in RAW. We've got other high speeds as well. You can shoot up to 4K 120p. There is a 15-minute time limit on that because of overheating issues, but for 4K video, if you're shooting normally at 24, 25, or 30p, there is no recording limit. So this is going to be a very useful camera for conventional use. If you're shooting at 24, 25, or 30p, for standard use and you're doing some overcrank stuff in slow motion, I think see this being very useful. If you're shooting HD, you can go up to 240p, and the camera also shoots C-Log 2 as well as C-Log 3, and the usual PQ HLG as well as Canon 709 color spaces. You've got simultaneous proxy recording, and something that I think will be beneficial to some photographers, because I know people have been asking us for this a long time, you can actually shoot simultaneous video and stills. Now the stills will be JPEG only, but if you're shooting a video and and you also want to be able to grab some stills at certain moments out of that file, it does have that capability. So this will be really interesting to see what people are able to do with that. So let's talk about the star of the show with the EOS R1, which is autofocus. And the autofocus on this camera is very impressive. Now, I do want to also issue a little disclaimer. I use this for a day. There is a little bit of a learning curve because there's a lot of options in terms of how you want to acquire focus and what it is that you're trying to track or focus on when you're shooting sports, let's say. So I will say that even though it's a little bit of a learning curve, it's not too steep. Every button on the camera is customizable. So if you want to switch modes or you want to switch the approach or the technique that you're using with the camera to acquire autofocus, it does happen really quickly and it can be very intuitive. So having said that, let's talk about autofocus and how the R1 is going to see things. So let's say for a minute we're shooting sports, and in any given scene in a sporting event, there is a lot of things that are going on. You've got multiple players that are probably in different planes of focus, and those are different decisions the camera has to make on what to focus on. You've got the ball, you've got referees, you've got the crowd, you've got objects. There's a lot that's going on. Now, we do have an accelerator for the processor now, so Canon is able to analyze that scene and give you a lot of different options in terms of what it is that you want to track. So for example, the camera is going to take information into account, such as different players by facial recognition. It's going to take into account objects, let's say the ball, for instance. It's also going to define elements of each player. So for instance, joints on the legs, the torso, upper body, the head, the eye. Now, one of the things that I was most impressed with the autofocus is when you have it set up to do what you want it to do is the way the camera handles crossover. So for instance, let's say you're tracking a player. Another player walks in front of that person and all of a sudden they're not in view. The camera sticks on the other person. And I'm going to talk about a technique that they use for that because it really is cool. Now, obviously, when the person crosses over, that's a shot that's missed that you're probably not going to use because you're going to see somebody that's out of focus. But the impressive thing about that is the ability for the camera to stick on what it was that you were tracking so it doesn't have to refocus. And that's where you're going to have a hit rate that gives you shots that you would have missed had it done the compensation to readjust the focus onto another player. So Canon call this pre-registered person priority. And so what this allows you to do is take some stills of headshots. You can store up to 10 people in the camera at any given time, and you can recall them as you need them. So we tested this a little bit with some of these soccer players. You go ahead, you take up to 10 photos, and then whoever it is I want to focus on, it's going to give the camera priority for that specific individual. It's very impressive and it works. If somebody crosses over, it won't readjust the focus. If you have two players, let's say, that are in different planes of focus, but they're also both in the scene clearly, it will give priority to the person that you want. This is really impressive. I think probably more so than sports, it's going to be impressive for people who shoot events. If you shoot weddings and you want somebody specific in focus and you really don't want it to stray from that and you're trying to get your shot, it allows you a very useful algorithm that you can actually program into the camera and be able to recall. And another thing that's really cool is Canon did bring over the advanced eye control that we have in the R3. It's also been in other cameras over the years. Canon have had this technology for a while. It's actually really good once you get it calibrated. Now, I wasn't able to get this to show up on the HDMI signal, so I'll have to just kind of explain it to you. If you've used the R3, you'll know what I'm talking about. Essentially, it's going to have sensors inside the EVF that track your eyeball. This is really weird, but it works really well. So the way you do it is you set it up and you have to calibrate the camera in a couple different positions, and the camera will tell you what to do. It'll tell you to look up, look down. It gives you things to focus on. And you have to sit there for a minute and do this. Now, once that's set up, it allows you to kind of just look at objects in the scene, and you can actually program the camera to shift the object recognition wherever it is that your eye is tracking. And it's something that is very useful and very cool. And speaking of the EVF, it is a 9.44 million dot 0.9x magnification. It is excellent. I am one of those people who's not really picky about frame rate and so on and so forth within the EVF, and really anything above 5 million pixels is going to be great. This is an awesome EVF. I have no complaints at all. It's bright, it's clear, it's the closest thing to just having an optical viewfinder that I have used on any camera. The camera uses dual CF Express Type B cards. There is a new grip shape, so the body size is not the same as the R3. It's a little bit different. And then we do have the usual connections for Wi-Fi, as well as a 2.5 gigahertz base T wired LAN connection. And the camera is compatible with cloud services such as Canon.imaging as well as Frame.io. .io. And as you would expect on any pro-level camera, we do have a ton of buttons. Pretty much everything on the camera is customizable in terms of functionality. This is something that actually is very important because with as many autofocus options that we have, you do have to kind of specify what it is you're asking the camera to do. So I found that I did need to customize some stuff, and to be able to recall it really quickly, it is very intuitive. All right, so I want to talk about my opinion on the EOS R1, and just to remind you, I had a day to shoot with this, and so it's not a lot of time. It's also very early. My hope is that as we get closer to the release date, Canon has a sample available that they can loan me, and I can actually do some further testing with firmware that's a little more ready. I mean, I didn't notice any big bugs or flaws in it, but I do want to talk about the flagship camera for a second. So Canon are under a little bit of pressure with the R1. They're the last company to release their flagship. So with Sony, we have the A1. We also have the A9 III, which a lot of people argue is kind of flagship level. We also have from Nikon the Z9, which is a very solid camera. I think that Canon are under some pressure because they've been talking about it for a while, and now we finally got it. And is that going to be enough to live up to the expectations of what people view as a flagship camera? I think the autofocus is clearly flagship level. It's one of the best autofocus systems I've used on any camera. Once you learn and get the hang of it and have it customized of how you want to recall things, it really is incredible. I think it is the best autofocus that you're going to find in any of the cameras on this level. However, it is a 24 megapixel camera. Is that going to be a big deal to you if you shoot professionally? I will say this, you could argue a lot of things. A lot of flagship cameras have not been high megapixel cameras. That's not the intention. A lot of times flagship cameras, the intended audience here is going to be professional photographers who deliver with a limit of usually around 24 megapixels. So that's typically what they're going to shoot in. So that's fine too, but how does that distinguish this camera from something like the R3? It's very close to the R3. In fact, in many ways, I felt like this is kind of an R3 Mark II, especially when you look at what Canon did with the EOS R5 Mark II and how that compared to its predecessor. It's kind of similar. It's the only reason I'm saying that. And I was talking to Jared Pollan about this, of all people, and he even made the comment, and I agree with this, maybe it's time to redefine what a flagship camera is supposed to be. So do I think the EOS R1 is a professional camera? Absolutely, I would use it as a professional. It depends on what your needs are. I'm fine with 24 megapixels. I don't do a lot of cropping in post. I try to get it as right as I can in the camera, so I really don't need a lot more than that. However, not all photographers are like that. Some people like to crop, or they like to have the ability to crop, and if that's you, that will be a frustration point with this. In terms of video, I think that the overheating issues, I think that it works really well, and they really only apply to the high frame rate shooting that you're going to be doing as a video shooter. Most stuff that I've done with high frame rates is going to be B-roll, and I'm not going to film past 15 minutes. I'm not going to get anywhere near that. I'm just doing smaller clips of overcranked footage. For regular standard 4K or even the 6K RAW, you don't have those same limits, and so it will work, but it's going to come back down to expectations. And again, what do we define as a flagship? The other thing is we're going to be talking about flagship pricing on this, and I don't know at the time I'm filming this today what the price is going to be, but when you use the word flagship, it usually means we're going to be in the $7,000 to $8,000 US zone, or maybe even higher. And so does the camera fulfill enough of those expectations at that price point? So I actually would love to know what you guys think about this, or does this stuff even matter? Is flagship an outdated term? Leave me a comment below, and I also have a video on the EOS R5 Mark II, which I was very impressed with, and you should go watch that. I just posted that as well. I'll link it up here once it's up, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.